Uh-huh. Oh, it's a black one.
Some interesting times.
None of us.
The whole world is now worried about your part of the world. People still good work.
Pak je Jakub, jestli nám dá povel, kdy máme začít. Můžeme začít? Dobrý den, dámy a pánové, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, dear friends of the Forum 2000. When launching the first Forum 2000, President Havel wanted Prague to become a crossroads, an intellectual crossroads where a conversation concerning the major issues of today can take place. Not an institution, not an academic conference. It was meant to provide an opportunity for intellectuals, politicians, civil society representatives from different parts of the world to step back from the immediacy of today's political agenda to address major long-term issues concerning our societies and the world we live in. Two major concerns were on Václav Havel's mind when embarking on Forum 2000. One was a quest for a dialogue among civilizations in the age of globalization. As he put it, there is simultaneous uniformization and universal assertion of particular identities. This was one of the major concerns. The second concern was democracy and human rights, which obviously we identify with the founding father of the Forum 2000. Both aspects will be present in our discussion this year, the title being Democracy and Education. We all know Lincoln's definition of democracy as the government of the people, by the people, for the people. But there are citizens capable of grasping complex issues, form political judgment, share in decision-making. That was and remains a classic reservation and the well-trodden and very topical debate about the relationship between elites and citizens. The Enlightenment project had since the late 18th century its answer to the question. Democracy went hand in hand with the progress of reason, knowledge, and therefore education. Today, this assumption begs at least three questions. Is the Enlightenment assumption about the parallel progress of democracy and education still valid today? Yes, if we consider that literacy remains the best predictor of democratic development in what used to be known as the Third World. But our modern or postmodern democracies have evolved towards societies of individuals, the privatization of concerns, the culture of narcissism, as Christopher Lasch described it many years ago. Education not necessarily for better citizens, but simply for better careers or self-realization. The second objection is in trying to educate for democracy citizens who spontaneously might not necessarily be Democrats, isn't there a risk of confusing education for democracy with moral rearmament? And thirdly, and certainly not finally, Are we talking about education for a concept of liberal democracy as it developed in the West, or do we mean democracies shaped by different cultural or civilizational backgrounds, back to the debate about Asian values, Islamic democracy, etc.? The whole debate about cultural relativism is therefore reintroduced that way. So which version of democracy do we want to educate for, or perhaps even promote? Those who believe that aspirations to democracy is naturally, and I stress the naturally, since this is the title of our panel, universal, can reach problematic conclusions, such as, if all mankind aspires to democracy, we may be tempted to give history a push, smash a dictatorship, organize elections, and democracy will flourish. Or maybe not. These are some of the questions raised by the provocative title of our opening panel, Are We Naturally Undemocratic? And to address this topic, we have a very distinguished panel, which I will not give the biographies, you have them in your program, but I will simply give the order in which they will speak. They will have then the opportunity to respond to each other, and we will take questions from the audience after. The first speaker will be Frederick Wilhelm de Klerk, former President and Nobel Peace Prize from South Africa. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. May I say it's wonderful to be back in Prague, and I hope the conference will be a great success. We start with an interesting question. Are we naturally undemocratic? If one considers our primate cousins, the answer is probably yes. In virtually all primate species, the strongest silverback leads the troop and gets the first opportunity to breed with the females of his choice, thus ensuring the survival of his genes. With the arrival of our species Homo sapiens about 190,000 years ago, the principal vehicle of evolution shifted from the biological mutation of individuals to the much more rapid evolution of culture, language, and social systems. To start with, small clans of hunter-gatherers, like the San people of the Southern Africa, had fairly democratic systems. They had no formal hierarchies, they didn't have elections, but decisions were taken by adult male and female members of the community in consultation, with more weight being given to the views of the older individuals. With the development of urbanized civilization, societies began to compete with one another through wars, and it was usually those that had the most effective social systems and the best armies that prevailed. Virtually all societies were ruled by individuals or oligarchies. Democracies, like the Athenian democracy, were rare. By the end of the 16th century, the systemic requirements for societal success began to emerge in countries like Britain and the Netherlands. They were among the first people who effectively limited the power of kings to interfere arbitrarily with the activities and property of the emerging middle class. They were also amongst the first societies to dispense with religious impediments to the pursuit of knowledge and science. The result was an explosion of commercial, scientific, and technological activity. During the subsequent centuries, the British and Dutch were able to conquer the far richer people with older civilizations, like the Indians, the Indonesians, and parts of China. The reason they were successful lay in the fact that their societies assured their merchant classes greater political freedom, better protection of their property under the law, and greater latitude to study nature and to develop new technologies. By contrast, there were no Chinese or Indian West European companies that set about to trade with and conquer Western Europe. This was because their despotic rulers and static social systems did not permit or encourage such ventures. China's exploration of the world during the early 15th century was brought to a shuddering halt after 1433, when the Zhuan Emperor ordered his subjects to suspend their overseas voyages and to destroy all their long-distance vehicles and vessels. During the 20th century, ladies and gentlemen, there were further clashes between social systems. First, between the free world and the totalitarian racism of Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire, and subsequently, during the Cold War, between the Western democracies and the totalitarian Soviet Union. The Western democracies emerged victorious from both struggles, leaving Francis Fukuyama to declare somewhat prematurely and hubristically that the end of history had arrived. Mankind had at last developed the ultimate social system. It included democracy, free markets, the rule of law, the protection of property, universal education, untrammeled research, and technological development and social security for all people. However, we know history never ends. As Aristotle pointed out 24 centuries ago, a critical element in societal success is not only the system of government, but the integrity and freedom from corruption of the rulers, whether they are monarchs, aristocrats, or democrats. Democracies, ladies and gentlemen, can also be corrupt. In many instances, elections have become auctions in which politicians compete to offer voters more and more for less and less. Ultimately, governments can keep their election promises only by borrowing money that they will never be able to repay. There is also a tendency for the ruling class of bureaucrats to take an unaffordable share of the national wealth in their efforts to mollycoddle the public and to over-regulate the producers of wealth. Following the end of America's unipolar dominance, social systems are once again beginning to compete with one another. Now, on the one hand, it is the new Deng dynasty in China, based on state capitalism and a new class of mandarins, educated at the Central Party School of the Chinese Communist Party, and the European Union and United States democracies on the other hand. This coming struggle may well answer the question of whether or not we are naturally undemocratic. On the one hand, democracy is important and perhaps essential in permitting people to control their governments. On the other, the Chinese might be betting that their new class of educated and disciplined mandarins will make better decisions than the self-indulgent and ill-informed electorates of the West. We are living in interesting times.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. And now I turn to Roger Scruton, professor of philosophy, well known in this country for his connection that goes back to the good old Baldo days of samizdat descent. And he's launching this week in Prague a new book, at least for the Czech readers that may be of interest. Roger Scruton, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thank you for inviting me here. I have to say I agree with almost everything that President de Klerk has already said. I just wanted to add a few details, however, and bring the topic round to the subject of education, which I gather is our topic for the whole of this event. I see that the fundamental truth as being this, that we are naturally competitive. Whether we are naturally democratic or non-democratic has to be seen in the context of the fact that we are naturally competitive. We compete for prizes, we compete with each other for the rare goods that are obtainable, and we do this in every sphere of human endeavour, including the pursuit of knowledge. Everybody who has taught in a school is aware of this. You ask a question and the children put up their hand, eager to be the first to be asked his or her opinion. This is the natural competitiveness of children, competing for attention of the adult and for the credit that comes from showing that they have the knowledge that is being put in question. Is this part of getting on in life? It's a part of living fully and properly that we should do this. And in areas like sport, nobody has any objection to it. Everybody understands perfectly that the point of playing football is to play it well and, if possible, better than everybody else. And teams in schools are shaped by this natural ambition. And I think Dr. de Klerk was absolutely right in referring this to our evolutionary history. Competitiveness is an adaptation of the species. It is something that pushes us always to improve our genetic endowment. And if we ever relinquished it, we'd be destined to extinction. We see this not only in our species, but also, of course, in our neighbouring species that we have to deal with every day. Everybody who rides horses knows that as soon as the herd is galloping, your horse wants to be first. And if it didn't have that desire, its genes would never have got it to the place where they are. So in education, competitiveness is vital. It's why we have examinations. It's why we are constantly giving each other prizes, trying to recognize achievement, and distinguishing those who are capable of knowledge from those who are not. Now, this, however, impacts on another natural feature of the human condition, the one that Nietzsche said was central to the modern world, namely resentment. When somebody succeeds and takes the advantage over me, I have a natural instinct to resent it. And resentment can build up, it can accumulate through a life. It can also become a major political force, in which those who feel cheated by the success of others get together to pull the others down. And we've seen this not only in politics, especially in this part of the world, but also in education too. The force of resentment in my country led to enormous educational reforms devoted to downgrading examinations, to removing competition wherever it occurred, and to changing the curriculum and the syllabus so that hard subjects, subjects that made children, put children to the test, were gradually downgraded or made of no greater significance than the soft subjects in which everybody can succeed. The ethos of self-esteem was put in place of the ethos of success. And education became a battleground between, roughly speaking, those on the left who believed in equality and those on the right who believed in distinction and success. Now, that story is a long one, and it was not played out here in the same way, but it was played out here in politics, in which the competitive instinct, which led to the victory of the Communist Party in the post-war period, was also gradually replaced by the same Communist Party with the instinct for resentment, resentment made into a universal principle of government. And I think that this suggests that when we ask questions like this, are we naturally democratic? and what is the place of the democratic ethos in education, we realize that we're pulled between two competing forces. Competition, it seems to me, has two different forms. One, the natural form, the other, the artificial form that we are all hoping for. The natural form of competition is that in which one person strives to dominate the rest. And that person, if he succeeds, will then impose upon the rest his view of things. However, we hope for another form of competition, a non-natural form of competition, in which the person who succeeds doesn't want to dominate, but simply to be heard. That you compete in politics, for example, in order that your voice should be heard, and then you make room for the voices of others. That, it seems to me, is what the democratic instinct is. I don't think it is a natural thing. It's something that's acquired by civilization. The instinct not just to succeed, but having succeeded, to allow a voice to those who didn't. That is a very difficult state of mind to achieve, and I think it's one that we have to learn in the classroom. But we will never learn it if we think that competition is inherently a bad thing. It's not, it's inherently neutral, but it's something that we need to use in order that the voice of the other can be heard in our own decision-making. And I think that is what we need to teach in the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. I'm sure this last dimension you mentioned, that is the need to conceive not just competition, but political competition and the rules of the game, and are these rules, can they be taught? How does one develop a political culture? That is certainly behind the debate about at least the way Western liberal democracies function. Our third speaker is Mona Siddiqui, who is a professor of Islamic and interreligious studies at the University of Edinburgh. Please.
Thank you, and thank you to Forum 2000 for this invitation. I'm not going to repeat what's already been said about the evolution of democracy, but let me just say where I'm speaking from, because I think that's important when we have big words like democracy and unnatural. So I'm a Muslim academic. I teach in the Divinity School in Edinburgh, and I have lived for most of my life in the UK. So for the interest of this discussion, I'm really talking about not just democracy, but a liberal democracy, where I have flourished. Would I have been able to do the same job, speak about the things that matter to me in the same way, both in public life and in academic work, if I had not lived in a liberal democracy? So I don't want to create an abstract theory of democracy and actually be disingenuous about the fact that I couldn't imagine my life outside a liberal democracy. Having said that, I think there's a paradox about democracy, the unintended consequences of where democracy can lead you. So I'm coming from the UK, where we've just seen the Labour victory of Jeremy Corbyn, and the press are still trying to get their head round how somebody who's so far to the left can have got the majority votes in a democratic system. Is this what people really want? A few years ago, we had the international media wondering about the unintended consequences of democracy when Hamas rose to power. So there is a paradox about democracy, and I suppose it starts with where I feel what Amartya Sen said, the economist and philosopher. He described democracy as a universal value, and his case is about democracy's instrumental effectiveness, that it's not value in itself, but it brings about the realization of certain values that we want to hold dear. So it can bring about pluralism, it can bring about good education, and it can bring about freedom of expression. Yesterday, we heard 4 speeches at the opening ceremony, 4 rather passionate speeches about people who are fighting or speaking for democracy. And in the absence of democracy, it becomes something worth fighting for. But as I look around, I think that we are in a bit of a dilemma in the world at the moment. One half of the world wants more democracy, and the other half seems to have become bored of democracy. Democracy has not been the optimum state. It's become something that we now take for granted. And when you start taking something for granted, it becomes boring. And I try to put that into context with what Fukuyama was saying in his first spoke about the end of history, in which he argues that actually boredom itself will lead to people fighting against democracy. Is that even if the world, by any stroke of magic, became a world where citizens lived in pluralist democracies, liberal democracies, they would be bored of that. And for me, that touches on a little bit of where I see the rise of fundamentalisms across the world's regions. Not because everybody is bored of democracy, but because fundamentalism offers an alternative view. It offers an alternative way of thinking about society. The other question I would ask is, can democracy ever do away with the old ideological movements? So one of my areas of teaching is Islamic law, which is usually reduced to Sharia. The other area of my teaching is Christian-Muslim relations, which is usually reduced to Islam and the West. And I think that irrespective of what kind of democracy we talk about, one of the things that democracy hasn't been able to do is try to build a world where everyone is a we. We are all part of the same we. There is no other. There is constantly a society showing another other. And what do we do about the other who is not democratic, who is not liberal? Is democracy good for the poor? I'm not sure about that. Recent academic papers that have looked at the economic effects of globalization and liberal democracies are contesting whether democracy is good for the poor. And the other thing with democracy, I suppose, the two questions I would leave you with is, do we have a moral right and a moral responsibility to bring about democracy where there is no liberal democracy? I'm not even sure about that anymore. Not because I haven't enjoyed, as I said right at the beginning, living in a liberal democracy, but I think we are far too sweeping in our judgments and assessments of global societies. The only last thing I want to add, and again speaking from the UK context, and this will probably be brought up later on throughout the conference, is what happens to religion in the public sphere of liberal democracies. I fully applaud that the state has a moral responsibility to grant equality to all its citizens. Equality under the law is an extreme position itself. It's worth fighting for. Equality irrespective of gender, sexual orientation, and religion. But what does that mean for religious voices? Any religious voice that wants to have its voice heard in the public sphere, which destabilizes what equality means under the state. And I'm talking about various things in the last few years: gay rights, gender equality, the rights of the church vis-à-vis the state. There are many people who are now saying that there should be an alternative space for those who want to not necessarily fight against liberal democracy, but say that there are other visions of conceptualizing society. So one of the questions I would hope that we can pick up is, what happens to alternative voices? Where do they find their voice in liberal democracies, which seemingly gives everybody a voice, but where we know, all of us should know, that there are simply certain things you cannot say without being targeted or stigmatized? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure the question you raised at the very end about the place of religion in a democratic society as an alternative, as you say, well, by definition, any democracy needs alternatives, breeds alternatives. The question is, are there alternatives within the concept of liberal democracies, or are they trying to seclude themselves, be outside, next to the mainstream of the liberal polity? That would be, I suppose, my question, but others will come back to it, I'm sure, in due course. Our fourth speaker is Peter Pidhart, needs no introduction here, former dissident, writer, Prime Minister, President of the Czech Senate. Petr, great pleasure to have you.
First of all, thank you for invitation. My today's thesis is that the supremacy of the economy over the politics is the main cause of the present-day decline of the trust in democracy, not our human nature. Or, put it shortly, outsourcing of democracy. I don't think that as a homo politicus we are undemocratic by nature. The entire civilization and culture is essentially a stumbling yet clear effort to break out of the laws of nature, specifically the golden rule that the stronger one prevails. It is, however, unnatural for democracy to be controlled by the mechanism of market. Then the homo politicus shrinks resignedly to homo economicus. We are not undemocratic by nature, but under some circumstances we resort to undemocratic stance. People turn away from democracy when in distress, when they are strongly afraid of something, or, and this is my thesis, when they experience that they constantly make wrong choices in the elections, that therefore these elections cannot achieve any change. Then they feel deceived by democracy, resign on the participation of the public space, and reject politics as such. Almost nearly half of the eligible voters in my country does not vote anymore. The voter turnout was 96% in the first free elections in June 1990. And during the last elections to the European Parliament, only 2 countries have had, considering the average, less than half European voter turnout, under 20%, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. Moderator of this panel discussion, Jacques Rupnik, called his book of interviews about the Czech politics a democracy tired too soon years ago. Why just those 2 countries? And why too soon? To get some relief from demanding pressure of civic duties without desirable results, one then decides either to look for a leader or for a de facto rule of PR agencies shaping the image of political parties. It means to move, to outsource the responsibility onto someone else than the voter. The option of the leader is chosen by those in distress who see in black and white. Voting then means handing in the responsibility, outsourcing to someone else. The option of the advertising agency is chosen by those who have reconciled with the fact that even parliamentary democracy is driven by the laws of the market. The voters vote for parties, also they know that these have hired agencies not only for the PR, billboards or mottos, but for the program as well. The parties, the experts of the agencies, and the voters sell and buy themselves mutually from and to each other in the system. They, in fact, unsource parliamentary democracy, which is supposed to set the priorities of the entire society. The outsourcing is being spread widely these days. Our Ministry of Justice had until recently tens or hundreds of own lawyers, but hires law firms for more serious legislative tasks. This enables the distribution of money to certain friends, along with the suggestion of desirable results of their expertise, which then turn into bills. But not only has the executive power let willing experts earn money, even the members of the parliament hire law firms for the preparation of bills and amendments to the acts. Outsourcing of the parliamentary democracy not only confuses the voters and enables corruption, but leads to the conflict of interest as well. The laws are de facto written by those affected by them, the clients of the hired law firms. It is a form of privatization of democracy. A lot of money have started to control the politics through other means than traditional sponsoring without notice. And they have started to limit the public space. There is no wonder what the voters are then tired by their own wrong choices in the election. Today is the most important of all, to regulate financial industry. And just it doesn't happen. Therefore, fatigue and the resignation of voters. The responsibility for all this rests on the shoulders of the politicians. Those leading their parties should ensure that the people will be able to differentiate one party from another without the affection of the ideas of PR experts or without revealing a scandal of the competing party. Otherwise, the parliamentary democracy will be henceforward controlled by money and by experts in the area of subconsciousness. The malignant trend of outsourcing politics is not a coincidence, but an unfortunate result of the current dominance of economics over politics and specifically current dominance of finance industry over traditional economics. I would like to return to the name of the Rupnik's book. Why have the people just in our country got tired by democracy too soon? I think it is because the Marx philosophical basis that the politics, the life in public space is only a superstructure of economics, experienced two successful boom in our country during 90s. The market, so-called without adjectives, the main priority dominated assertively public debates at that time. The market criteria decided about matters concerning everyone. The ranking of values, what less valuable should be sacrificed for the sake of more valuable. These matters might be decided by public debate, not by economists. It is still our, not natural, but civilizational and cultural choice. The choice has to take precedence over the interest of economy, which is the growth at all cost and profit of the wealthiest. The price, the sacrifice, would be in the end just the public space, politics and democracy. Two great sacrifices for unreliable promises of economists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this meditation on the premature fatigue of democracy in this part of the world, and some of the hypotheses you suggest, I'm sure, will be discussed. This symbiosis between the economic market and the political market, I'm sure, is one, and perhaps also we are reflecting on this subject, almost 25 years after. So there was an assumption that democratic values were somehow instilled in Central European societies by the rejection of the totalitarian experience. So there was a whole generation that bought into the sort of dissident ethos of democratic values, the primacy of democratic values. Well, societies have moved on. There's a new generation of people, and democratic values need not be taken for granted. Hence the question about education. Do you need special concern for education towards democracy in societies that have only relatively recently rediscovered that? Our last but not least speaker, Marek Adli, who is from Egypt, a human rights lawyer, and heads the Center for Economic and Social Rights in Egypt. So, floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think we have not a clear answer till now of this question about if we are democratic or not, because we are, as an Egyptians, as an Arab people, we still haven't the right to choose. We haven't our right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And everything is related to those things. So we didn't experience our abilities yet till now. So I'll bring for you a quick example from Egypt as an answer of this question. Nowadays, only the voice of the state was to be heard. Only the state's story was to be told. Thousands of journalists, bloggers, activists, and even people using internet social networks had to be silenced. A lot of TV presenters, journalists, photographers, bloggers, and social media activists were forced to leave their works. They are facing hundreds of judicial investigations, huge fine penalties. Some have been in detention for more than 2 years without clear or specific charges. And the result is Egypt now is holding the highest number of journalists behind bars since record keeping began in 2013. Most of those people tortured and insulted. Pro-regime media continuously attack them. They are deprived of their rights to fair trial and they are sent to specific courts called terrorism courts. They are tried by pro-regime judges announcing it on their benches, to the lawyers and accused victims commit dozens of crimes without any kind of accountability, without any way for victims and their lawyers to seek restoring their rights. Among thousands of cases, I'll share with you one of the cases, which is the case of Ahmed Maher and Muhammad Adil and Ahmed Doma. Three of them is from the founder of 6th of April movement, which is one of the most important political movement in Egypt and during the days of revolution. As one of the results of the arrest, a group of activists, because of their participation in a protest against the military trials for civilians, Ahmed Maher was summoned as one of accused with organizing that protest. Dozens of activists decided to head to the court in the same day of investigation in solidarity with Ahmed Maher about this protest. They demand of investigation with them also because all of them participated in this protest and it's their freedom of expression. The police refused to allow to all of them entering the court. Actually, they closed the court this day. Suddenly, it was a lot of security forces. It was a kind of harassing of those people and they start to clashing with them. After that, they summoned three persons, Ahmed Maher and Muhammad Adil and Ahmed Doma, and accused them of illegal protesting, insulting the institutes, attacking policemen, disabled traffic, destroying private property. In less than 1 week, they sent them to the court. In front of this court, it was a lot of legal defense. The court didn't even reply most of them and sentenced them with 3 years in jail. In front of appeal court, we proved to the court by videos and testimonies and documents and by the testimony of policemen themselves that the three activists are innocent from what they are charged with. In addition, we surprised of refusing the appeal. Everything now, it's not about democracy. It's not about law. It wasn't even about fair trial or right of people or those things. Everything is about politics. It's about fabricating everything now of Egypt by a network of beneficiaries. So if we have a lot of infected institutes and these institutes supposed to monitor or control a kind of election or a kind of those democratic ways, we will not succeed in it till we succeed on our struggling against this regime, against these institutes, to reform it, to remove it. Then we will experience ourselves. Maybe then we will have an answer for this question. Thanks for you.
Thank you very much. I think the whole question about the Arab Spring, and particularly the case of Egypt, is I think, very important for our subject. The assumption is, if democracy is naturally a universal aspiration, then the fall of a dictatorship will bring or should bring a democratic transformation. And we read many essays, articles written at the time, 2011, on that subject. Well, we've seen what happened. We had elections, Muslim Brotherhood, and the same people from Tahrir Square who were the bearers of that initial democratic momentum started saying, but they are not democratic, they are squeezing democracy, or they are imposing their own version of democracy. So I'm sure this is a theme to which we may want to return. But before we give the possibility to the audience to ask questions, are panelists wanting to respond to each other? I have raised a few questions as each of you spoke, but you may or may not want to respond to them, but you may want to respond yourself to what you've heard.
May I just say that there was a sort of a thread throughout all the discussions to acknowledge that democracy is not as successful as it could be, that there are substantial good grounds for being critical of how the system of democracy has developed and what it achieves and where it fails. But in the end, I think we need to compare the system of democracy with undemocratic systems and say that notwithstanding its failures and its shortcomings, people living in democratic countries are more free, human rights are better recognized, they have more opportunity, and therefore, warts and all, the democratic system is the best system.
Yeah. Well, that's the famous Churchillian motto, which I'm sure Roger Scruton will endorse, but I think we need not to persuade ourselves of that. Is the question, is this universally valid? Because one thing is to say there is a universal aspiration to human dignity or to freedom, but does it mean to democracy the way it is understood in Western liberal societies?
I think the points that have been raised by Malik Adli are very significant here, that we in Britain did not achieve our democratic government just like that overnight. We already had the rule of law in place, and in particular an independent judiciary. And what you were obviously complaining about is the fact that the judges are not standing in judgment objectively over the cases before them. I think that the existence of that rule of law really from the 17th century onwards in our country made it possible gradually to introduce other institutions which eased the political structure and gave a voice to opposition. And I feel that's the aspect of democracy that people tend to overlook. It's not about giving a voice to the majority, it's about giving a voice to those who oppose them. And that's the difficult thing to achieve.
Yeah, that's I think the best definition about how unnatural, so to speak, democracy would be. Giving the voice not necessarily to the majority, but making sure the minority has that voice. You will probably agree with that.
I'd agree with that. The only thing I would add to that is, so if we do take ourselves to be political animals in the Aristotelian sense, that we naturally want to be engaged with something to make our lives better. Democracy is an instrument. It has a potential to make your life better. But what we're also seeing largely in liberal democracies is higher levels of people's personal unhappiness. That irrespective of having a political framework and a social framework in which we are free to express, or as Roger says, that the person who might be silenced in another political context has a right to express themselves in a democracy. So the question I'm just posing is, what was the ultimate aim of democracy? Is it just to give people a voice? I'm not saying just in a merely sense, but is it so that people can participate? Or is it also to make us feel good about ourselves, happy about our lives? And I'm not sure that that is where we are in many liberal democracies. Perhaps it's a question that we don't ask ourselves. But if you look at the statistics across recent research, the two are not necessarily compatible. So maybe we'd be more unhappy outside liberal democracies. I'm just saying that irrespective of how perfect this system seems to us, it's not necessarily leading to contentment and happiness.
Mm-hmm. Well, the point about democracy precisely doesn't profess to have a goal. We are marching towards a radiant future where happiness will prevail ever after. So democracy doesn't, it's a process, so it doesn't have such a teleological mission. But then the question is, if the goal of democracy were to make us feel good about ourselves, well, this is what I mentioned in my introduction, that the whole debate about the privatization of concerns. Yes, if the point of democracy is to favor what Germans call Erlebnisgesellschaft, the true possibility for each individual to realize themselves, yeah, but that is an individual goal, that is not necessarily a feeling of a collective polity, of citizenship, of engagement, and possibly of participation. So when Peter Pithart spoke about the decline of participation, well, you can well have the enjoyment of freedom. This is what Benjamin Constant in the 19th century said. You have the democracy of the enjoyment of individual freedom, and then you have something else, which is democracy of participation in public affairs. And these are two things.
But I think people feel disillusioned with participation. And if I look, going back to the UK last year with the Scottish referendum, the reason why there was such a high turnout, notwithstanding all the nationalist debates, was because people felt that there was something worth fighting for. And if we lose the philosophical sense of personal struggle, whether it's a civic struggle or a personal struggle, then we do become complacent, we become bored, we don't want to participate. So it's not even about personal happiness, it's also about the reduction in active citizenship. So what is it about, you know, is it a good democracy when people are bored, basically? Because there is nothing to struggle for.
Well, if Ernest Gellner were here, he would probably say, yeah, what's wrong with people being born? People follow their things, and they get engaged in public life when they feel there is something at stake, as you say, or their pursuit of happiness, as the founding father had it, would be jeopardized. Do others want to join in onto this theme?
I think it's dangerous to put happiness at the top of the agenda. For me, politics is about allowing each person to be unhappy in his own way.
Yeah, it's a great Tolstoyan wisdom. Thanks for that, Roger. I think this may be, yes.
Can I make one more point, which I think is important? If we analyze the conflicts around the world, there are two main reasons for it. Either it's destitution and extreme poverty, or it's the failure of governments and those in power to effectively accommodate diversity. And it's on the second point that I want to make a point. We need even our established democracies to recognize the challenge that all countries are becoming more diverse. Cannot be better illustrated than by the influx of refugees at the moment into Europe. Immigration and migration is the reality of the new so-called global village. So diversity is a big challenge. And how to accommodate important minorities, whether it's religious, whether it's linguistic, whether it's ethnic, but important minorities within the larger societies, is a challenge for democracy in this new century in which we find ourselves.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that, because that really brings us to today, to Europe. And as we know, Central Europe is very ambivalent about that issue, this country in particular. Time is running out, so maybe this is a time to open for the questions from the audience. I say questions rather than lengthy speeches, and if you could introduce yourself when making the questions. Yes, please. And then over there, and then over there. Okay, 1, 2, 3. And perhaps if there is somebody you want to address the question, or if it's a question for the whole panel.
It's a question for the whole panel. My name is Marco Fernandez. I'm a professor at the School of Government at Tec de Monterrey in Mexico and a researcher at a think tank called Mexico Evalúa. The question is, how do you reconcile, on the one hand, that it is being said, and the literature shows that that education is necessary for democracy for countries to transit toward democracy, because I mean it has a positive effect on levels of participation, engagement, etc. And on the other hand, nowadays we observe, despite higher levels of educated people, a lot of the population mistrusting the democratic governments. And particularly, given that there are two former politicians in the panel, how do you change this situation? I mean, yes, leadership is important, but at the same time, political incentives for politicians to act matter a lot. How do you achieve those incentives to change the current situation?
Let somebody else take the lead.
Yeah, well, anybody else?
Well, I think that it's not necessarily the duty of politicians to educate people. That is the duty of the media. And I think one of the problems is that our media have taken the line that the quantity of the audience is what matters, and you must come down to their level in order to achieve that quantity. And it means that the enterprise of debating public issues at the highest level has been relinquished. But the public debate is not there, and so inevitably people feel distanced from all the questions that the politicians are dealing with. But politicians can't educate the public. They have to assume the public for what it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose education there was meant in terms of leadership. You show on certain crucial issues a certain stance, and that's a kind of education of sorts, I suppose you could call it, if I understood what was behind the question. Yes, I think we had a... Or did you want to come in on that?
I'll wait.
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to add that it's not just about the media, though, Roger, because the media does take sides on what it wants to feed to the population. So it's not working at an abstract or working at necessarily at lower level. It decides its politics, and it informs people according to its politics. And at every election, whether it's for a party leader or a general election, the media decides who it wants to support. And that's how it then informs the masses. And I think, just a quick response to that, I think, and again I go back to this idea of disillusionment, that people don't trust politicians. People don't trust politicians because they think of them as a separate class of people who speak the language to get the votes, but actually don't do anything for the people when they're in power. Now, maybe that's in itself an extreme thing to say, but that's the general opinion, and that's why there's always such low turnouts in general elections.
Thank you. Yes, please. Could we have the microphone? No, first there was this gentleman and then you.
My name is Jan Trnka. I come from Charles University in Prague. I was really intrigued by a lot of the points that Professor Siddiqui was mentioning in her speech. And I think there are some really, really deep issues which I would like to hear more about maybe sometime later. But I was just, when you mentioned at the end that, do we have a good democracy when everyone is just happy and complacent? But I think we're not in that situation at all. I think a lot of people in many countries, and including European countries, are actually discontent. I mean, they're unhappy. They don't like the system, they don't like their lives, etc., etc. But their reaction, instead of taking part and trying to change that, is actually to give up, to not go to elections. And actually, Mr. Pithard, he was speaking about that. I mean, so a lot of, I mean, there was mentioned here that democracy is the best system that we have, and that's how it is. But I think our democracy in the whole world is ill. I mean, there are actually very deep issues with how it works. And maybe this is something that should be really talked about, not just saying, democracy is great. Well, it isn't, for many reasons.
All right. This was more a comment than a question, but does anybody feel like responding? Maybe we take the next question as well.
Can I just say
yes,
one thing?
You certainly can.
If there's disillusionment with all the existing politicians, it's time for new politicians to stand up and to make their criticism against how the existing politicians are handling affairs, their platform, and say, we offer something new. That is what democracy is about. It offers the way to any person who doesn't like what exists to put something in the place. The challenge, therefore, is I admit all the failures and the inherent weaknesses. In most democratic countries at the moment, there is disillusionment with politicians. It's time for those with a strong conscience who say political leaders are there to serve, they are not there to serve themselves. They are not there to put their imprimatur on people, but they are there to serve the people. Such voices should form itself into movements, activate civil society, and where necessary, establish new political parties and challenge the existing ones because of their failures.
Please.
I'm Konstantin von Eggert, and I'm a participant from Moscow in spite of the name. My question is to actually President de Klerk. As someone coming from a country that is, well, let's say, a fairly recent democracy in the proper sense of the word, what to do when electorates are disillusioned with democracy in a transitional country? Because when they're disillusioned, as Mona Siddiqui said, being just overfed democracy over centuries, that's one thing. But when they are disillusioned in transition, as Russia is today, is there a way out? Because sometimes it seems that democracy is doomed, at least for the foreseeable future. We had elections last Sunday where democratic opposition got a miserable 2%. And coming out of here, I can tell you, even if it was the fairest of elections, they wouldn't have gotten 22. So is there a tool? Is there a way out? Thank you.
Well, I think the fundamental challenge, if you have to manage transition, as Mandela and I and others in South Africa had to do, is to start by negotiating the rules of the game, by having a clear vision of where do you want to go. In our case, the clear vision was, we want a powerful constitution. We want strong rules which will balance conflicting interests. We took 4 years to negotiate that constitution. Today, there are disillusioned people who used to support me who say, I made too many concessions. There are amongst black South Africans a substantial percentage who said, Mandela made too many concessions. To my mind, this is proof that we had very good negotiations. There wasn't a winner-take-all. If in a transition there's a winner-take-all, then you have the situation which you describe in some other countries, where there is great disillusionment and where the result of the transition has not resulted in a better life and improvement for the majority of the people. So I would say good negotiations and agreements which carry the support of the majority of all the factions in society. I can honestly say that when we signed up to our constitution, it had the support of the majority within each of the 8, 9, 10 significant parties which there were on the political scenario at that stage. Negotiation, agreement on basic rules, and also institutions which can then protect that agreement which was reached. In our case, we have a constitutional court which can override even Parliament if Parliament passes laws which are unconstitutional. That sort of checks and balances ensures that the transition continues to carry the support of the majority of the population.
Well, I think this is the most important behind the debates about democratic change. Yeah, you can have topple dictatorships and have elections, but what you describe at the end, that is process which takes time and which takes a certain political culture to develop, and that is where perhaps education comes in a very broad meaning of the word. There was yeah, over there, the speaker.
I have two brief questions. My name is Professor Hans Köchler. I'm Professor of Philosophy at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. First, concerning the concept of democracy, it seems to me that we are using it in a rather superficial manner, and we should pay tribute to the legacy of President Václav Havel in that regard. Is it not the situation that what actually exists as so-called liberal democracy, wherever here in the States or in Europe, is in fact not a genuine democracy? For instance, in my country, and it may be the same in most, the parliamentarians who make the laws, and that is supposed to be an essential thing of democracy, officially decide on the basis of the free mandate. But never do we practice a free mandate, but it is a coercive situation in which the party to which the person belongs gives the instructions. And in Austrian terminology, even we have a very open term for it, Clubzwang. That means the coercive power of the party club. And if someone doesn't behave accordingly, he will be considered a wild deputy. But whatever, this is certainly not participatory democracy in the sense, for instance, Václav Havel meant. And I just would like to know what the Czech speakers think. I remember the second speaker from the Czech Republic has expressed also certain concerns in that regard. Second question, very briefly, concerning the Egyptian speech. What about the policy of double standards? About the policy of double standards when things happen as you described, and when the government of Egypt came to power in a coup d'etat and also used lethal force, killing thousands of people, everything is documented. How can it be that Western leaders who consider themselves as propagators of democracy, such as the Prime Minister of Germany or also the Foreign Minister of Austria, would engage in official, more or less, policy of recognition of General al-Sisi, and, for instance, would make a statement, as the Austrian Foreign Minister did when he visited Cairo, that General al-Sisi is a factor of stability in the entire region, totally overlooking what is really happening there, namely that we have a kind of fascist form of a kind of fascist secular system that oppresses dissent in a very brutal form. How can a European leader be credible? And by that I conclude. How can a European leader be credible if he makes business as usual with that kind of regime in Egypt? Thank you for your attention.
Well, we have two different questions. I don't know who wants to tackle on it. While they're making their mind, I would simply say, when you say this is party democracy or parliamentary democracy, not participatory democracy, as dissidents of Václav Havel thought, well, I don't think you need to oppose the two as strictly as you do. And secondly, let us remember that historically, education for democracy developed within parties. Parties were, so to speak, schools of democracy. They had party education for their members, etc., etc. So, yeah, that would be my sort of reservation, not to the general question you posed, which may be addressed to...
I mean, just on the point of parliamentary democracy, I don't know of any other system that could work. I don't understand how participatory democracy outside parliamentary democracy would work. I think you need both. But of course, when parliamentarians get in, they often don't do what they've been elected for in the first place. But that's still what we have, and that's still what we're working with. In terms of double standards, I won't speak for Egypt's case, but I think Western governments, rightly or wrongly, in the political sense, have to work with double standards. They have to condemn bigotry and oppression in certain Muslim countries, let's say, for what they're doing in the political front. But they also have to liaise with Muslim countries. So let's take UK and Saudi Arabia. After the Raif Badawi case, there was huge condemnation that we cannot have somebody who's been sentenced for execution or flogging on the one hand, and then do business with the government of that country. We do it all the time. And governments have a very clever way of exempting themselves from that moral debate in the interests of strategic interests. So I think on a moral level, it would be great to say, how can we have double standards? But we all work with double standards. The important thing for me is that we have a society where we can at least hold governments accountable for that double standard.
Yes, I think our guest from Egypt would need to respond to that one.
There is some points I need to inform you about. There is no any kind of stability now in Egypt, okay? And people now paying a lot of prices as a voucher of the government of this regime, and this regime is created a new kind of militant, religious, fascist in Egypt. Maybe sometimes you will saw some people on the street demanding of killing this one and killing this media presenter or those things. People now clapping their hands for execution in Egypt. So I think, and of course they are burning the books in the primary schools in Egypt. So you can imagine maybe we will have some crazy generations or fascist generations in the coming years if we cannot reform some of these situations. So I think the solution will start from the point of linking any kind of cooperating with this regime, with some reforms, with some extent of respecting the international obligation of this regime. And of course, it's related to the level of monitoring and the condemnation of violation from this regime. And of course, there is an important point. I think some of countries have to think about the issue of selling this kind of regimes a lot of weapons to use it against his people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have, this will be our last round of speakers, and maybe we take the 3 questions, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Yeah, well, I think, unless the organizers tell me otherwise, I think we have time for, we have 5 minutes, 3 questions, okay?
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I am Youssef Ramrani. I'm former Minister Delegate of Foreign Affairs of Morocco. I was a Secretary General of the Mediterranean Union. I will be very brief in one comment, maybe one question for Frédéric de Klerk. I think we share the same values for democracy. And I will speak from a Southern perspective. Today, if implementing democracy is a priority for us, but I think the process will be long, difficult, and complicated because of many reasons. And one issue to tackle here is the ongoing conflict in the region. It's impossible today for us to implement democracy if we continue with this conflict. If the international community is divided as far as has to bring the responses to this conflict, I'm talking about Syria, about Iraq, we were not able to solve this conflict. And then, why not solving this conflict, the extremists and the jihadists are taking the lead. And this, again, will complicate the implementation of democracy. I agree with President de Klerk that we need some kind of negotiation. We need some kind of consensus. We need some kind of compromise. These are the instruments of democracy. Education, yes, it's part of it, but from the Mediterranean and southern perspective, ending conflicts, deconstructing the jihadist discourse is one of the utmost priority. And that we need time, but we also need our partners. And here, as I'm in Europe, and my question for you too, how Europe sees the reshaping of the Middle East, how Europe needs some new tools on its neighborhood policy to face the challenges. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a very big question, and I suppose the whole conference will be a way of attempting to answer it. Yes, we have a question at the back, you, and yeah.
Thank you very much to such a distinguished panel. My name is Teresa Novotná and I'm based at the Université Libre, which is Free University of Brussels. I guess as a political scientist, I would also argue that low turnout in the elections is not just the sign of gloom and doom of democracy, but it's also it can also be argued that it's actually the citizens are satisfied with the way how things work. So I just want to be a bit more positive. But I guess my question, or I guess I would offer maybe an additional or alternative explanation of things. If we see democracy as expressing a voice, I think nowadays in in terms of social networks, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, especially young citizens have feeling that they can express themselves through these means, and they then don't sort of bother to go to the elections or to participate in democracy. So perhaps the challenge for the democracy in 21st century will be how to channel this activism in the virtual world into activities in the real political arena. And I would be curious to hear what your views on this are. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that opens yet another big subject, that is how much what goes on the internet and networks, etc. Is this part of education for democracy, or as we now discover in many places in the world, this is an education to counter democracy or to provide sometimes very violent alternatives also to democracy? It can be both. Third speaker, yeah, we have, I think it was you, and that will be unfortunately all because we are already run out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the panelists for very insightful comments. I am Ahmed Galal, and I come from Egypt. So you're getting too many Egyptians in the room, I guess, this morning. I have a comment, I have a question and I have a comment. I mean, I find the question for the panel to be a bit unnatural. I mean, are we democratic by nature or not? Well, we are not in a lot of other ways. Forget about democracy and the way we organize ourselves in society. Well, we have discovered things in engineering, and now we ride planes. We do things that we didn't do as human beings long time ago. So the question really is not, in my mind, whether we are naturally or unnaturally democratic. I think the question is, what kind of democracy? How do you get there? Otherwise, what is the alternative system? Religion as a system? It's not. So it has not been historically, and it's not right now. So, I mean, I think that really the question for the panelists is, what is the alternative? I think President de Klerk pointed out that this is the best we have, and let's work out with it. That's the question. Now, on the being an Egyptian and sitting in the room and hearing what has been said, I sympathize a great deal with what Mr. Adli said. In transitions, there are all sorts of mishaps. But I think it's a complete misunderstanding to see everything that's happening in Egypt only through the lenses of democracy and some practices in some places. The fact of the matter is that priorities. Egypt is not Switzerland. We don't have well-established democracy and liberal democracy and respect for Bill of Rights and so on and so forth. You're going through a transition, and transitions, lots of things happen. And indeed, I sympathize with what he's saying, but you have to remember also what is the battle that's being fought on the ground. And the battle was having a regime that is fascist, that is going to change the identity of the country, and then people go to the streets. I mean, they went to the streets in January 2011 and in June 2013. And the army backed them up in both instances. This is the people wanting what they have. So while I sympathize with what he's saying, I think characterizing the situation the way it has been characterized is a mischaracterization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, but we really have run out now of time. So if there are very brief responses from the panelists, I don't know, we start here. I don't know, you want, I think Peter said that he didn't.
I don't hear.
No. So
okay,
up to
just
you.
very briefly.
Can I just say about the question? Sorry.
Let's start.
No, I just wanted to say.
We're moving this way.
Just to explain my position, I am not saying that liberal democracy is not a good thing. I started off by saying that I've lived in a liberal democracy. I can't imagine where else I could have said and done so many things. What I'm saying is that are we taking the status quo, not because we're satisfied with it. At the end of the day, everybody wants the same things. We want food, we want shelter, we want a good life. All I'm saying is that are we becoming so satisfied that this is the optimum we can achieve that we are actually disengaging from public life? So democracy is something you need to nurture and to feed and to engage in. Otherwise, when other people step in, then we can't stand back and say, oh, but my voice... And the only other thing I would say is that it's not just about getting your voice heard. People want their voice to be channeled into something. So social media allows you to have your voice heard, but it doesn't necessarily channel your voice into something constructive, unless there's a mass movement of something. So, you know, for me, the unnatural and natural is really about, is liberal democracy the best we have? And if it is the best we have, why are people getting more and more dissatisfied with it?
Okay, others?
In reaction to the question from the front, let me just say, in violent conflicts, and if you face the challenge that it must come to an end, I think there are a few prerequisites. We don't have time. Let me just mention two. Firstly, the situation needs to be stabilized. You can't successfully negotiate in an unstable situation. Secondly, there need to be on both sides, or if there are more than two sides, on all sides of the conflict, a realization that I'm not going to win this war, that the country will just be totally demolished, and that therefore the only solution is to go and negotiate. Lastly, the problem in many parts of the world at the moment is terrorists have no goal other than to destabilize.
Yes.
I have only a little point. It's about the regime of Brother Muslimhood in Egypt, or Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. It was an elected regime. So if we need to remove this regime, it has to be by elections also, not by tracks of military forces. And that's what happens. And we didn't deny there is millions of people get into streets on 30 of June, okay? But after that, the military control everything, and it became a military coup, clear military coup. So this is the issue. The issue is what it wasn't about if Muslim Brotherhood are fascist or the current regime are fascist. The two are fascist, but if we have an elected fascist, we have to remove it by election. Thank you.
Thank you. Roger?
I just wanted to make a point of agreement with the young lady who mentioned the point that when people are bored with politics and politicians, this isn't necessarily a bad sign. It might be that they have something better to think about. And it might be that their social instincts are engaged in other activities. It might be also they don't feel that there's such pressing problems around them that they need politicians to solve them. You know, I think a measure of boredom in public life is a sign of health. Just imagine what a marriage would be if it had to be based on constant fermentation of interest in each other.
Well, thank you for this. It works both ways. Either politics is boring and you withdrew into enjoyment of privacy, or you decree that politics is for people who get bored at home. That could be the converse conclusion. I was asked to make conclusion, but we don't have time for it. I will simply stress one thought that I think may be relevant for the rest of the conference and the theme of education. And that's the point that I think Roger made at one point, say that democracy is not about just giving power to the majority, but it is about giving a voice, securing a space for the minority. This is not a natural, spontaneous inclination, even of Democrats, and it is something that goes together with, I think, President de Klerk and what Mona Siddiqui also referred to, and that is the need to accommodate diversity. And how do you do that? What is the right constitutional framework? You may want rely simply on the constitutional framework. You may stress the need for freedom of speech, but at the end of the day, you need a public spirit. You need a political culture that will accommodate that. And this is what the democratic process is about. And this is where education, in this very broad sense, for democracy matters. This is all we have time for. I think we have to thank the panelists. This was a great panel. Thank you.